All right, so let's get started. Welcome to the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative panel, Governing AI Through the Cloud, the Role of Compute Providers. I'm Robert Traeger, Director of the initiative. I'll be moderating the session today. So we have today a topic which could not be more of an active topic of discussion in the world today. We have the Korea AI Safety Summit coming up in less than a month. We have shortly after that the AI for Good Summit of the United Nations. We have shortly after that the final release of the final report of the UN High-Level Advisory Board for AI. And that's just scratching the surface. It's on and on and on. And the things that they'll be discussing include the potential of the technology, but also the risks of the technology, including disinformation, loss of control, democratizing of the ability to do violence, including CBRN, other bracing topics. So today we have what I must say is a cutting-edge topic and some fantastic folks here to discuss it. So we're going to be discussing not just AI governance, but compute governance, and in particular, the way that cloud providers can be intermediaries between governments and AI developers in hopefully governing and maybe even regulating compute. And in particular, we're also going to focus on the international aspects of that, on whether it's reasonable to think about an international governance regime, and if so, how we might get one started, and what some of the primary challenges to that would be. So we'll start with two presentations by Leonard Heim and Janet Egan, and then we'll move to discussion among the panel, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So to begin with Leonard, he is a researcher and team lead at the RAND Corporation and the author of numerous studies of compute governance. He is quite simply one of the most influential writers on AI governance today and a sought-after voice in government deliberations on these topics. So Leonard, over to you to begin the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Robert, for these kind words. To give people an overview, I think I will only be talking for 5 minutes and hand it over to Janet. I will mostly cover the argument why, tiny bit why compute is an interesting governance node, and then go into the details why we think and what we think the cloud providers, computer providers, which role they can. I usually just like to start with my favorite chart, which just shows the compute trend. So what we see on the chart here is over time, different AI systems and how much operations, how much computing power they're required to be trained, right? And what we see here, this is an exponential chart. And one thing which I added to this chart here in contrast to other charts, I added the cost here. So what you see, whenever we move up one bracket, it's not 7 million, it's 17 million, 700 million. Up on the uppers one's 7 billion. And what we also added here, the two thresholds, which we see in the EU AI Act and in the US Executive Order. In the US Executive Order, it basically says, if you train a system which surpasses the threshold, you got to give us a heads up and fill out the survey and undergo some red teaming evaluation based on some upcoming standards, actually. And in the EU AI Act, this means if you surpass this threshold, there's the presumption of the systemic risk component. And again, this just highlights that compute is already being used as this tool, and that compute is this idea of a proxy where we say, well, if the system is bigger, trained on more data, it requires more compute, and therefore potentially poses a bigger risk here. And we try to leverage this when we talk about compute providers here. This also means, this is the big caveat here, we talk about the most compute-intensive systems, and those are usually these foundation models, these frontier AI systems. This does not apply to every system. This also does not mean we basically address every type of risk which AI can pose. We talk about these risks posed from these frontier AI systems, similar to the focus recently, a couple of months ago, in the UK AI Safety Summit, where we talked about these kinds of risks. And then briefly, I want to walk through this chart where we basically say, well, there's this compute supply chain, or more like the AI compute supply chain here, where we see on the most left side, the compute production. Again, into the details here, but somebody's producing these chips. You probably heard about companies like NVIDIA, TSMC, ASML, they eventually produce these chips, these cutting edge devices, hardware we need for training them. And what we did in previous work and what we want to leverage basically in the work we're discussing here today is the idea of like, well, these chips go somewhere. And most of these chips do not go like to single individuals. They end up in big data centers. We're talking about like warehouse-sized facilities, which are industrial facilities, which then house them and then offer this computing power often as a service, either to your own company or to any other company out there. So this is the focus here, basically. I'm going to be highlighting now. It's like this idea of this compute provision, right? There's like those who construct these data centers and then who operate these data centers and then make this computing power available. Because on the further right-hand side, we then see these AI companies. They're using this AI, this computing power then to create, to develop and deploy these AI systems. And this already highlights to some degree the role we are discussing here today is this idea of like these compute providers being this intermediary role here. So what we see in this chart, basically, we have these AI companies, which are our regulatory target. They develop these AI systems where we might be worried about them posing certain types of risks. And we want to use compute providers as those who basically, well, do business with them, who provide them the computing power as this intermediary between the AI targets, between the AI companies, which are the targets, and the regulators. So basically, we say these compute providers, they help to enforce regulations. And they then can report these violations to the regulators, again, if the mandate is there. So the regulators are also the ones who set these regulations on the other side. And in the paper, we discussed this concept via 4 key capacities, which we think these compute providers, cloud providers, can play a role for the AI governance. First, they're the securers. They're safeguarding AI systems and the critical infrastructure. There's lots of talk about making sure that these model weights are being protected and secured, that other nations or other bad actors are not able to steal them. And cloud providers play a critical role here. Again, as a complement, as a supplement to the AI developer. It's eventually to both of them to secure the model weights and all the other IP. They also play a role as record keepers, which can basically enhance the visibility for policymakers. They can play a role as verifiers, where they can verify certain customer activity, basically ensuring the oversight, making sure people are playing by the rules. And lastly, if people are not playing by the rules, they can also act as enforcers, so they can take actions against rule violations by simply cutting off access to compute. I'd like to give some more examples and details here. Again, we have security, record keeping, and verification and enforcement. And the idea of record keeping, for example, is just generally gives us more development and more insights into these kinds of things which are going on right now. And we're already seeing this being leveraged again, for example, in US executive order, where there is a requirement reporting for single big, large computing clusters. Again, and this is also just get the visibility who has the compute and also learning who's using this. This is not necessarily coming with particular mandates right now, but a first potentially good governance step to just like learn what is going on. And this is particularly timely if you think about like endeavors in the UK and the US around national AI resources, because sovereign compute. In the US, we have the NAIR, the National AI Research Resource. In the UK, we have the Future of Compute Review, which basically asks, is there some type of market failure here, which we need to address here, given that it looks like most of the industry is building these big, big systems, and academia and others cannot participate, at least at the frontier of these types of systems. Should we try to give them more computing power to basically address this? Then verification and enforcement are like to something like more stringent. They're building on top of this. But no, we have this requirement under the UEI Act and under the US executive order to basically report training runs if they are above this certain compute threshold. And what we are saying is compute providers could be the one who can verify this. They can at least check if everybody is supposed to report such a system did so. And then lastly, the last that we propose here is like the enforcement. For example, if somebody didn't report a system or the system didn't undergo the evaluations we wanted to undergo, they could then basically just be cut off and not get access to the computing power. That's it from my side, from the basic theoretical assumptions here, and again, the key capacities here. And I will now hand it over to Janet, who's going to walk us through the implementation steps and the international aspects of this.
Thanks a lot, Leonard. Janet, I will introduce you very quickly. So now we'll hear from Janet Egan, a researcher at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School, and a former fellow at the Center for the Governance of AI. She was also many years in the Australian government working on policy issues spanning geopolitics, cybersecurity, emerging technologies, foreign investment, critical infrastructure, and regulatory reform. She's currently on leave from the Australian Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, where she was the inaugural Director of Policy in the Office of Supply Chain Resilience. She's one of the authors of the paper Leonard described, and she'll speak about internationalizing this AI governance approach. Janet, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks, Leonard, for kicking us off with the overview of compute governance and how we can be using compute providers as regulatory intermediaries. I guess I wanted to situate us in where we are today in terms of the steps being taken towards using compute providers as intermediary regulators. So in January 2024, so this year, the US actually proposed rules that require US compute providers to identify and report foreign customers and flag if they undertake any frontier AI training runs. And so to be clear, this one is actually a lot broader than just looking at frontier AI because it stems from work on combating malicious cyber activity as well. So it's any threshold of a foreign customer using US compute provider resources. But it does start to leverage the compute providers as one of the tools in the regulatory bucket of identifying when AI training runs are happening. But it's important to note, and you can see here in this graphic, the lines are what's currently proposed, and the dotted lines are things that if there's an opportunity to expand here to actually use more of these governance capacities. At the moment, it's mainly centred around record keeping, complemented by reporting to the US government. So things like verification and assisting enforcement and reporting violations of regulations aren't currently yet activated, but there is a potential for the US to expand these rulemaking process to include that. Important to note, this is still in the development phase, so the US is seeking comments on these proposed rules at the moment. They're closing at the end of this month, and then they'll reiterate and refine the approach. But a key thing here is there's still a lot of open technical and governance challenges. Like some of them include privacy preserving standards to make sure that you're preventing government and regulatory overreach into commercially sensitive data. Also, how would you structure governance models to manage anti-competitive tensions, and particularly when there's a strong link between a compute provider and the AI developer who's using their resources. But one we're really keen to dig into more today is the international side of things. So there's a really key need for international cooperation because there's three sort of emerging risks that we're starting to see already from unilateral US action. And so the first risk is that overall, when it's enacted unilaterally by one country, even one with such broad control of the compute market like the US, regulatory arbitrage could diminish oversight. And by that, we mean that there's an incentive for AI developers, particularly those who might not subscribe to adhering to safety standards or may have more malicious intentions, to relocate their activities towards lower scrutiny jurisdictions. So acting alone, countries that implement stronger oversight requirements may actually just shift problematic or risky AI development to other jurisdictions. There's also a key need for information sharing to prevent evasion. And so we often look at examples like know your customer in the banking sector, where you can avoid detection by, making many originally you could avoid detection by making many transactions just under the reporting threshold or dividing up your activities across different jurisdictions or different banks. And so in the compute context, there'll be need for sort of information sharing between compute providers themselves, but also across jurisdictions. And that can give a better understanding of which actors might be using significant amounts of compute that would normally trigger an alert if it was within one country, but you can then sort of get the more global picture. And the last one I'll dive a bit more deeply into today is the sovereignty and privacy concerns. So essentially the US model is requiring US compute providers, which have quite global footprints, to be reporting to US government on all foreign customers and their activities. And that has already raised concerns with a number of countries, even like-minded ones. So in March 2024, we had the French AI Commission in their report come out to really flag concerns about protection of business secrets, American domination, and economic intelligence problems here. And what's really interesting is they didn't have this in their English translation. This was just in their original French version. So it's starting to show that even between countries you might usually think is more like-minded or more sort of democratic and aligned countries, there's still these risks emerging. And similarly, Canada, so this month, they've announced $2 billion in compute funding and ambitions for an AI sovereign compute strategy. And the Deputy Prime Minister really flagged, look, they're going to reduce Canada's reliance on privately owned computing outside of Canada. And so this is starting to show that there's a real movement against having US oversight of individual countries' own AI developers. And it makes a lot of sense from the sort of strategic picture and the economic picture that these technologies could potentially be very transformative. And there's a lot of concerns about maintaining sovereignty over that. In a conversation recently, I think it was the Netherlands flagged that some in Europe actually seeing this as the Huawei moment for the US, that European countries are very uncomfortable with this level of oversight. So that brings us to what could an international regime look like? And essentially, there's a lot of different options that could use domestically implemented regimes combined with government-to-government information sharing to have sort of a harmonised approach that it mitigates against these risks. And a key question here is around what international forum could take this forward. So a lot of folks are sort of suggesting the G7 format could build on the Hiroshima summit and the Hiroshima AI process to get like-minded countries in the room to start to make these commitments for domestic sovereign respecting regimes that can coordinate internationally on an aligned approach. But it's important to note there's real trade-offs between inclusivity and trust. So bringing together a really broad church of actors can often diminish the like-mindedness of the grouping and then undermine international efforts to take that forward. So it tends to water down what the ambition could be. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of investment in AI compute, particularly by countries in the Middle East like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. You may have all seen Microsoft's recent deal with $1.5 billion going into Abu Dhabi's AI company G42. Similarly, Saudi Arabia has been looking to try and allocate as much as $40 billion towards AI investments. So in countries where there's very cheap and reliable energy and where there's dedicated state investment to build up more compute capacity, there's a real question is how effective could an oversight regime be if these folks aren't brought inside the tent early on? And so this is probably a question open to the room and for further reflection as well, is what further work can be done to sort of build a coalition of countries that are close enough in intent to actually enable work to happen and enable trusted reporting and information sharing, yet at the same time capture enough of the compute leaders in the world to get proper oversight of AI development and risks.
Great. Thanks so much, Janet. And now I'd like to invite the other two panelists onto the stage, Noah Zilberman and Vili Ledonviota. We'll try to have a five-way discussion here with the hybrid folks who are still here and can hear us, even though they don't appear there. And I was told that maybe their faces would appear over there, so we'll have to wait and see. There they are. So we should try to speak into these. Yeah. All right. I'd like to turn first to Noah, who leads the Computing Infrastructure Group in the Department of Engineering Science. I wonder if you could give us a sense of where the technology is now, and among the things that have been talked about here today as possible governance regimes, what technology already exists in your view, and where do we sort of need a set of research projects? What do we need the research projects to do? What governance capacities do you think they enable?
Thank you. So I'd start by saying that to begin with, cloud operators build their data centers in a manner that is supposed to provide privacy for their users, and largely speaking, they don't have visibility into what users run. So users are running within virtual machines, within containers, and this is intentional. So consider the customers that may be running within the cloud. You might have a legal company, or you might have an accounting company that have their customers' data. You don't want the cloud provider to have visibility into that. So we build the infrastructure in a data center, both software-wise and hardware-wise, to be inherently transparent to the cloud provider. It doesn't mean that the cloud provider doesn't know entirely what the users are running, because you need to tailor the infrastructure. You might need stronger servers, you might need higher network bandwidth, you might need further storage, you might need to use certain accelerators. And the customer may also ask you to provide certain applications or certain services. So the cloud provider does have an insight into that. Now, talking specifically about AI, and we're talking specifically about frontier AI. For frontier AI, you do need to have dedicated setups that are extremely high-end. And because these are also extremely expensive, as you can assume, that means that the customer is working closely with the cloud provider. So the cloud provider does have knowledge if a customer is running a frontier AI model, but he doesn't know what type of model they are running, and they don't know what is the data that is being used. And the use of different models isn't something that is visible to the cloud provider. Now, cloud providers still have monitoring information. This obviously comes because they need to build the customers, but it may not be sufficient to do the sort of, to provide the sort of insight that governments may want. Research has started to look into that, but it is very, very limited. So for example, I have a certain given setup, I'm running on a certain machine, several machine learning models. I can show that I can distinguish between this set. This has two limitations. The first one is that if you skew this setup just a bit, maybe add a couple more compute nodes, maybe slightly delay the responses, you may not be able to identify what is running. You can't use the previous training. And that's one of the biggest challenges. What will happen if cloud providers will try to classify the running machine learning workloads based on the information that is visible to them, and it is slightly skewed, they might get wrong results. The other big problem is that the quality of the workload classification that currently exists, or rather, most of the workload classification that currently exists just says what kind of workload is running, and not machine learning workloads, just is someone running a sort of a website sort of workload. Maybe they're running a streaming service, maybe they're running machine learning, but it's 1, 2, 3. It's not what type of model. The other part is that the quality of the classification is not good enough. So let's say that there is a certain work, it doesn't exist yet, but that can classify it 90% accuracy. Now assume that you are Google or Microsoft or Amazon, and you see with 90% accuracy that the customer runs a model that they are not supposed to be running based on the regulation. And you go to them and you say, look, you are running something that you are not allowed to run. And it turns out that your classification was in the 10% error. For surely you'll need to pay the customer a lot of money for that. So the cloud providers can't allow themselves to have this sort of machine learning classification performance. They need to achieve near certainty in terms of the technical classification. And we might be able, and I think that Leonard and Janet touched on that, to get information through other mechanisms about what the customer is running, but we are not yet there at all in technical terms.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So I want to give the next question to Vili Ledon-Viota, who is the author of a book, Cloud Empires, and a professor of economic sociology at the Oxford Internet Institute. He is one of the most cited authors in the world on gig work and the platform economy. So Vili, I know you've been collecting data on cloud computing around the world. So can you give us a little bit of a sense of what that constellation looks like and how it's evolving and how you think that geographic distribution relates to some of these, and I know this is a difficult question, some of these efforts at global governance?
Sure, Robert. Thanks very much. That's a lot of ground to cover, but that's exactly true. Recently, I've been super interested in this question of, well, where is the digital world physically anchored and located? Because in some ways, the idealistic era of global internet governance, let's govern the digital world as a global commons, seems to be coming to an end, and there's more of a sort of every country for itself almost mentality emerging in international relations, or at least the new, whether it's a G7 based or some other new international regime that hasn't quite emerged yet. So at the moment we're in a situation where who holds the infrastructure holds power to regulate the digital world. And so we've been trying to map where is AI compute. And there's a little bit of a caveat which is necessary, is that obviously it's very difficult to measure compute because it's not really a sort of fungible commodity that one unit of compute is the same as another. You can use units like flops, but in the end, the sort of performance of a chip or an architecture on a given task will depend on the particulars of the task. But with that caveat, I mean, there's for sort of AI relevant compute, there's basically three types of providers. There's the government computing facilities, which used to be called supercomputers, of which Janet Egan mentioned these new efforts to build kind of government-owned GPU clusters. But there's a sort of long history of them. And broadly speaking, that's been something, most of those have been in the United States, and then sort of Japan joined that game, and then China, and also various European countries. And now in Europe in particular, there's a Euro HP high performance computing initiative, which has built two kind of supercomputer clusters, one in Finland, one in Italy, which consists, the one in Finland at least, consists of about 10,000 AMD GPUs. So it's AI relevant compute. But so to kind of summarize, that picture is very much sort of global north, where that government-owned compute is, and also very much sort of a US, China, and to some extent EU game. And then we have these new players like the Emirates saying, okay, we're going to invest a lot into AI-relevant government-owned compute. But those efforts are still very much ongoing. Then there's the biggest one, really, which is this public cloud, which is mainly Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, to some extent IBM, to some extent some Chinese cloud providers, Alibaba Cloud, Tencent Cloud, Huawei Cloud, which provide GPU compute, AI-relevant compute capacity as a service that you can buy online. And one of the things we've done is we've mapped where are where in the world do these public cloud providers provide the ability to spin up virtual machines with a given type of GPU chip? And basically what we find is that, first of all, there's these two AI superpowers, US and China, in which there are many such regions in which you can spin up GPUs. Then there is a sort of second tier of countries which have they are hosting some GPU cloud compute on their soil, which is of a sort that it's relevant for training AI models. So this is latest NVIDIA chips, A100s, H100s. And these are mostly global north countries. It's about 17 countries. Global north countries except India also is in this club. So we kind of, in this working paper, I was just working on before I got here, literally, we're kind of trying out this cheeky terminology. We're calling this the compute north. And then you've got this second tier, which we're calling the compute south. And those are about 13 countries that have AI cloud compute on their soil, but it's of a sort that's more relevant to running models, to deploying AI systems developed somewhere else rather than actually training your own AI systems. And so they'll have NVIDIA V100 chips. And then in addition to this, this compute north, which has the kind of compute for training AI, and the compute south, which has compute for running AI, you have the entire rest of the world, most of the world's countries, which are compute desert in the sense that they don't have AI relevant cloud compute at all.
Can I ask a quick follow-up and just ask how quickly do you see it changing? I mean, you mentioned the UAE, and how quickly do you see it changing? And maybe a question also for Janet or Leonard, that, you know, often compute is compared to oil, you know, sort of the new oil or something like that. And we think of all the wars that have been fought over oil and the disputes. And so I wonder if it is changing sort of quickly, in a way, should we be surprised that there is almost a relative lack of geopolitics over these things? Or would we expect, you know, sort of major powers to attempt to control this evolution even more than they are?
Well, is it changing? How much is it changing? On the one hand, yes, this is a very much a sort of moving target that my group's research is aiming at, because NVIDIA is launching new chips all the time, and also AMD and Intel and others are entering the competition. But having said that, the distribution, in a way, of the compute over time of technology in general, has remained quite stable in the sense that, you know, it's been a few global north countries that have the tech and have the infrastructure. And then we've also interviewed people about this and asked, well, you know, how do you see this picture changing? And there's basically two different models or scenarios. One is that the new sort of AI training relevant, development relevant compute continues to be introduced mainly in the US and maybe in Netherlands and maybe some other kind of strategic hubs, because the training can in any case be done remotely. So you don't really need to have it locally. And if you're friends with well, you can do that. With the exception of then, you know, countries like France saying, no, actually, we won't allow you to train remotely. You have to train here. And then it's up to the big tech companies whether they then decide to invest also in building local kind of high-end compute in, let's say, France. The other model is that, no, it all kind of diffuses over time, that it just sort of starts in US and to some extent in China, and then, you know, compute gets commoditized, and over time, actually, it will be cheap and everyone has as much as they want to, and it's just, we're just living in this kind of a market demand or supply crunch moment, and that's why it's all very politicized. And I think there's truth to both models. But actually, I think that it will continue to be a somewhat scarce resource, maybe not as scarce as it is right now, and it will continue, and is increasingly something that is then wielded as a kind of geopolitical tool. And it's not, I don't think it's just now, that's also not something that's kind of a new thing, that technological infrastructures are used as a means of kind of exerting influence over other countries. There's this wonderful new book by Farrell and Newman, The Underground Empire, where they summarize this history of kind of US extraterritorial influence via SWIFT payment network and some others, and then kind of Chinese government trying to replicate some of that infrastructural power in Southeast Asia. For instance. But then we say, sorry, one more thing, which was like, well, are these initiatives like UAE's, are they now poised to change the picture? And actually, I think no, because if you look at the sums involved, I don't remember how much UAE is putting into this, but you know, the Chancellor of Exchequer here announced 900 million pounds earmarked for national AI compute. And at the same time, Amazon announced that they are spending $30 billion just on their Virginia data centers, albeit over a slightly longer period of time. But the investment scales that nation states are able to muster are actually not at all matching up to the scales that these multinational public cloud providers can muster.
Yeah, thank you, please.
Just to add one more point to that, we need to take into account that to train really the frontier models, the really state-of-the-art models, we are talking about more than just access to GPUs. We are talking about data centers that have tens of thousands to scale of 100,000 nodes that are dedicated to train a single model. So that's basically the size of a data center that is dedicated to a single user that is currently running the training, and typically also using the GPUs that were just mentioned. So if we are asking, is it likely to spin up more data centers that can run frontier AI models anytime soon in what we call the compute south? Probably not, in my opinion, because that means that someone goes and builds specifically in a certain country a data center that is for a single user to run this frontier model. I'm not saying that it can't happen, that countries will not strategically decide to build it. But if we are looking on the public cloud model, it's unlikely that one of the big cloud providers will go and build away from them or away from a strategic partner, a data center that will dedicate it just for that. And that's why we see these clusters in the US, in China, in certain leading countries where you can actually train. And we do have, in terms of research infrastructure in the UK, data centers that have GPUs that can be used for training AI models, nothing on the scale of frontier AI at the moment.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I wanted to also open it up to Leonard and Janet. There's been a lot said, and I'm curious if you have reactions to any of that. And, you know, for one, this idea that maybe we're living in a moment now where there's a restriction on compute that's temporary, and in the future it'll be less so, particularly when we're talking about frontier AI.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple of points. I think we talk a lot about the geophysical location of compute here. And I think this is like to some degree, a lot of times this happens because this is how it's with most resources in the world. Wherever it is, it matters, right? But I think compute in contrast to others, and like Veli and others were touching upon, it's like you can use it remotely. To some degree, just because the computer sits in country access, I mean country access using it. So this gives you, to some degree, the promise of well, actually, the physical location does not matter that much because you can open up to anyone, right? And this is pretty flexible. If we decide tomorrow we want to allocate all compute to different nations, to different companies, we can do so via this remote access tool, right? But on the other side, of course, everybody's not talking about like compute being like the strategic component. You're worried about like certain countries choking and cutting you eventually off. This is part of the reason why we see this move to like sovereign compute and building it in your own country. But again, I would just highlight again, I think to some degree, like it's become this meme or this vibe by now that just every country wants to build their own sovereign compute with explicitly talking about like, for what? I think for national security application, this makes a lot of sense. But I do, for example, if you think about Euro HPC, this is an interesting model where everybody's just like, look, guys, if we all work together within the whole EU context, again, even with the UK joining this now, this brings some promise, right? Because we can build a computer wherever it's best, where we have the most green energy, we can have economies of scale. We can say, let's just build a larger cluster of everybody else building a smaller cluster. So again, this infrastructure as a service brings a lot of promise there. And then on a point regarding, are we at an inflection point right now? I think one thing which I would just highlight here, to some degree, like the numbers. Last year, we produced around 500,000 H100s. This year, it will be around 3 million. This means we're just like by 6x, we're like doubling the number of GPUs being produced. This means, again, that these chips get exponentially better. This means whatever compute we allocate this year, this makes a tremendous difference about all compute and floating power in the future. If we, again, double the amount of computing power we have per chip and again, produce even more chips next year, this will get smaller, right? So like every decision in the future is to something like more important given the exponentials we see about compute here. But as I already touched upon, it's like the investments we a lot of times see from nation states, they sound big for a nation and for like the public investment regarding research. If you compare it to like what AWS and all the hyperscalers, Microsoft Azure and Google Cloud are doing, it usually draws this, right? Those like really small numbers. On the other side, we see now this 1.5 billion investment from G42 with Microsoft. I do expect these numbers to grow. And we have public track records from the Saudis, from the UAE. They want to invest more into compute. And again, this is of interest to all of these hyperscalers because A, capital, pretty nice, pretty good to use. And secondly, these countries maybe can make the promise of building out the required energy infrastructure faster and building the required green energy infrastructure faster. Because all of the hyperscalers we're talking about here have certain green commitments and they just want to, again, use green energy. And it might just be easier right now to build a nuclear power plant in the UAE than it is in the US, just given existing restrictions, starting from zoning laws and everything on top of that.
Janet, I wonder if you want to get in at all, particularly on the geopolitical aspects of things and sort of how you see developments in the UAE and some of the changes and whether it's surprising the sort of reaction or lack of reaction that we see from major powers.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and thanks all. I guess with the geopolitics and building on one of Leonard's points, what risk are countries trying to mitigate against, I think is a question that needs to be asked. So when I see Canada investing significant amounts of public funding in, sovereign compute infrastructure, for me, the question is, what risk are you mitigating against? Because essentially you're spending your taxpayers' dollars propping up facilities that aren't commercially viable in the existing market, or they would have had enough demand. And also you're doing it to not be reliant on US private sector players. And for me, there's a key question there in terms of, is it likely that the US would restrict access to Canada? So if you're China, a completely different question. And I think that's where you really see the strong geopolitics coming out to play. But I do think there is sort of a knee-jerk reaction to this idea of sovereignty for sovereignty's sake. And we see that happening in a variety of different industries across the board. I mean, Australia's just announced a big investment in solar panels because we want to build our own. And it's been really interesting to see how sovereignty becomes almost a good in and of itself. And so I think the geopolitics doesn't always play out in response to specific risks, but more broadly, an increasing sort of sense of nationalism around the world. The one thing I think is interesting is something that I try and keep in mind is that the relevance of compute to frontier AI could change. And so right now, as we saw in Lennart's incredible graph, increasing compute leads to increasing capacity. And because of that, everyone's investing strongly in compute. But at the same time, there are risks or there are chances that it could start tailing off with additional compute, or other limitations like the limitations on available data, or algorithmic efficiency breakthroughs could fundamentally change the relevance of how much compute you need to reach certain capabilities. And so I think when we're talking about being an inflection point now, we're at a time when compute seems to be the most viable bet going forward to have the strongest frontier AI. But that's something that could change in response to new developments. And I guess where I see the geopolitics also being watered down a bit is that it just isn't feasible. Like, the economies of scale and expertise that are needed to compete at the very frontier are very hard for a lot of countries to invest in and attain. So what we see is much smaller investments happening from a range of governments to say, oh, we want to have some sovereign compute at home. But in the reality, that compute is likely to be divided up across multiple different researchers and institutions, or put into specific projects, but won't be able to match what the private sector is achieving, and particularly at the frontier with Meta, Google, OpenAI. And I think that's also goes to show that there's a lot of unknowns in this space. And so you see a lot of governments wanting to make sure that they've got a seat at the table when it comes to AI and compute. But I don't think it's the same. I don't think many people have the ambition to or expectation to compete at the frontier with the current leading AI companies, just because of the scale of investment that's required and the barriers to entry with the expertise.
Thanks a lot. I want to ask, because often when we think about compute governance, I guess this is a question for maybe Janet and Leonard, although I think the panelists in the room also may want to weigh in. When we think about compute governance, we often think about export restrictions and the actions that the US has been taking vis-a-vis China, along with partner countries. So that's often, I think, what people associate with it. But what's interesting about the paper that was presented is that it is, in fact, a very different, I would say, conception of what compute governance could be, this idea that you have a cloud provider as an intermediary. And one of the interesting things about it is that is the sort of thing that, if you wanted to mitigate risks in the world, especially risks that are crossing borders, you'd really like all the countries in the world to be doing and participating in. And in fact, China is the largest source of cloud computing other than the United States. And so if you wanted to have a regime where you want to do some of the things that Janet mentioned earlier on, you'd probably really like to have the participation of this broader set of countries and certainly the major players in compute. So what I'm wondering is, how do you see the tensions between compute governance as sort of a part of geopolitical rivalry and being framed as kind of controlling this key input into AI production on the one hand, and this other idea about compute governance, which is it should be an intermediary. We all need to collaborate on this. Regimes will be much stronger if there's broad international cooperation. Can we do both those things at the same time, or is there a path forward that you see? Or is that too difficult a question?
I can try to say something. Oh, sorry, you go, Janet.
I can jump in with some initial views, and then Lena, I'll throw to you. In an ideal world, yes, you would want cooperation, and there's a lot of mutual benefit and mutual interest in sharing information about the frontier. How many frontier AI models being developed, at what thresholds, once they've crossed a certain threshold, at what levels of capability do you expect, and sharing results of red teaming and safety testing. I think the reality is there is just not the underlying trust between the US and China to cooperate on anything to do with reporting on compute or capability development when it comes to AI, because it's inherently in the US system seen as very dual use. But where I think there is a lot of hope for collaboration and a lot of mutual interest is reporting on the outcomes of safety tests, reporting on like emerging capabilities that have been identified. And so how I make those distinct is like, one is saying we've got this amount of compute dedicated to this particular model and we're training it at, you know, expected to launch at this stage and we're expecting these capabilities. That, I think, from like a US perspective, you just wouldn't want to be sharing that. Or if you did start to share, you wouldn't trust what people were telling you from the other side. But when it comes to, hey, we've been training a model, it's around this sort of threshold, and here's some of the risks we've identified, I think that's mutually beneficial information sharing. So in terms of how that would play out in a regime, I think that makes a lot of sense for US and other like-mindeds to partner in terms of sharing more granular information about how much compute is being trained, where is the frontier in different countries, and what actors are engaging in that space, as well as here's the results of all the safety testing, etc. But I think where there can be broader engagement is if you're training a model above a certain threshold, let's share information on the risks and mitigations that we found effective. But Lena, I'll throw to you as well.
There's not a lot to add. Yeah, I think like I agree with all of these statements, and I think just the thing to highlight here is again like cooperation on different types of levels. And again, there is more in the world than just AI, right? Which goes hand in hand with these kinds of things. And I mean, as Robert was just saying, I think unfortunately a lot of people think about compute governance, AI governance, using compute as a lever in terms of export controls because it's just the first thing they see. I think we now move to a world where we see like more nuanced and better instruments, right? A lot of what we talk about here is actually just gaining visibility, which I think is a key capacity every government should have to know what's been going on. And then also being more targeted. And I think another thing we try to highlight in this paper is, in contrast to export controls, where you basically need to act right now to have an effect in a couple of years, providing compute as a service gives you like way more flexibility, right? Again, this holds some danger because it can cut off access at any single point in time, but also provides, again, the flexibility to like do it based on certain conditions, only access it if you use like certain amounts of compute. Right now, if you only want to use 10 leading AI chips in China, you can't do this because you're not allowed to import them. I don't think this poses a significant risk, but you just have to set this hard threshold with a single chip because you cannot say, oh, it's only about 10,000 chips because again, once out of your hand, you don't have these controls again. And I think then the cloud holds like a lot of promise there to have these more targeted, more nuanced instruments, which then go hand in hand with all of the other comments we've just talked about, from red teaming, learning what's going on. And then we just need to learn on which risk do we agree on a global level and which risks are more likely to be discussed only on an allied level, right? I think national security risks are more likely to happen in these kinds of forums. So different forums for different types of risks.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard. Well, I actually have lots more questions, but I wanted to open it up to the audience in case anybody has some. And I see Sam does, and so we have a microphone so that the folks online can hear.
Thank you, really fantastic. Is this on? Yeah. I'm just become a senior advisor to the AIGI. And my background as a diplomat and kind of UN person. So I was particularly taken by Janet's question about G7 plus. What's the kind of trade-off between inclusivity and trust? And I think that the key question that is perhaps merits a kind of an additional paper by you is getting into the different types of risk that are associated with a crowd computing intermediary role, because I think that's really the key determiner of the effect that geopolitics has, and the fact that it's a dual use technology, the fact that we're moving towards greater AI sovereignty models, and I think that's inevitable, not just in UAE and Saudi Arabia, but in India, Brazil. You know, even if Canada doesn't want to rely on the US, I think it's not just because Canada fears it could be cut off, because AI is such an unknown quantity that in the future there could be commercial sensitivity for Canadian companies that derive from US servers. So my take is that certainly there's a first mover advantage in the G7 really embracing this and deepening and having common views. If they're going to then bring in the kind of BRICS Plus or the wider G20, you need really an incentive. One of the things you can bring in for the developing world is if you wrap into this, you're going to basically agree to have similar kind of protocols for your own crowd servers based in Saudi or new African Union or new ASEAN model, etc. But it comes with a kind of greater capacity building, some kind of added value. If you don't have that, there's no incentive at all, unless the objective is for the G7 countries to then have a stick by which they can, in the way that the US did a long time ago in the WTO over intellectual property, to basically deny other kind of trade or interactions unless this is accepted as a standard. So, yeah, so my last point on that was China is absolutely crucial, because China unlocks the BRICS, and China to an extent unlocks the G20. G20 has 80% of world trade, 80% of world GDP. If China doesn't want something bad to happen coming out of Saudi Arabia or Iran or Brazil or India, it has a real interest in interoperability of agreements on AI structures and accountability within the BRICS Plus. So I think that's a possible kind of lynch. I would go both directions. Could go G7, but add a sweetener, and then connect to regional groups that have, like OAS in North America and the various things. They combine countries on the right and the left, so there's less of a kind of a problem with confidentiality, because if you get, whether it's AU, ASEAN, some of the Latin America, Caribbean regional organizations, if you get buy-in there and it's wrapped into trade, you immediately take out some of the geopolitics and you consolidate it. So it's a long answer. I'd really be it's more of a comment than a question, but I'd love kind of your response, Janet, to that. And Noah, I'm really fascinated by what you were saying about the different types of training versus kind of operations, and what, if you could say more about what is the problem that we are trying to stop happening by the monitoring role of intermediates, and from a technological point of view, what are the constraints on trying to stop different types of things happening? Is it terrorists? Is it open AI being developed and being released into the wild in a bad way? Is it AGI risk? Is it what are the what can you delimit a little bit what's actually possible within that?
I think that maybe Leonard will actually be able to discuss it better. I'm happy to touch on the technical side, but the reason that we are doing, talking about doing the regulation, I think that I'll refer that to Leonard to respond.
Leonard or Janet?
Yeah, I can briefly touch upon that, and then I would just hand it over to Janet to talk about the international aspect. I think to some extent, yeah, we talk about frontier AI here to that extent. I think there have been various papers to talk about frontier AI risk. I think right now these risks are mostly discussed in a national security context. I think most people agree on that we currently do not see significant risk posed by these systems, be it Claude 3, GPT-4. The question mark in everybody's head is just well, what's about the next generation or the generation after? Do these systems eventually pose risks? So what most regulations and what I'm trying and many others are trying to accomplish is gaining visibility and checking the systems if they pose any risk. Before we deploy them in the world, let's check, do they change the geopolitical landscape? And then, of course, I think we're also partially talking about the vision and the potential dangers and promise of artificial general intelligence and everything which comes with it, all the promises and all the downsides we have there. All of these companies we mostly talking about here and targeting here do have an explicit goal of trying to build artificial general intelligence. And of course, my personal opinion, many other scholars share this opinion, is well, this poses significant risks. This changes the geopolitical landscape. We can start with how it's going to change labor, how it's literally probably going to transform this, from up to what does it do to the cybersecurity, cyber attack world? Or I think what's also been more prominently discussed, what kind of dangers does it pose, from biological risk? Does it allow actors to build new bioweapons and being able to misuse these kinds of things? So I think everybody's trying to figure exactly out what the exact threat model is. We can point to some things, but we just we can point to, again, to some things which might pose a risk, and we just need to learn what's coming down the pipe and see what's happening there. And this is part of the reason, I think, like part of the promise of frontier regulation. You check the frontier and you see what's happening there, because then you know what's happening next, right? When we saw GPT-3, this was basically telling you, hey, in a couple of years from now, more and more people will have these capabilities and this will be probably widely accessible. Is this a thing we as a society are okay with? Turns out we're okay with this. Turns out a bunch of good things are happening because of this right now, but also a bunch of bad things. And again, for frontier, this might be even like more extreme, depending on the exact risk you're talking about. And again, on the upper end of this, building artificial general intelligence, which I think questions a lot of our current working institutions.
Maybe to add one point in terms of the technical side. Well, most of what we are talking about is about the training. And it's important to understand that, because if we are taking the model that was generated by the training, we can run many of these models even on a laptop. Okay. So once the model is trained, a lot of what we have discussed so far is no longer valid. We will want to know potentially in the future, if we want to govern AI, what the normal user, the common user, is running, but they will not need to have these hyper complex, super expensive setups for that.
Can I add to that?
I just want to see if Janet wants to get in, and then it's over to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the comment, Sam. And I think you raise really good points about trying to build inclusivity through incentives as well and capacity building. I think tying to what Leonard was saying about checking the frontier, the reason I see G7 as sort of the prime, G7 plus as the sort of prime body for action in the immediate term is because it brings together countries that have the capacity potentially to be engaging at that frontier level, and then sort of the results or the insights gleaned through cooperation between those with the most significant resources dedicated towards AI development then sort of shapes how broadly do you need to engage the rest of the world. Like, is actually that there's not that much risk and okay, let it rip. We don't need to worry so much about this, or is it, oh, there are some like risks that we want to manage more mindfully as an international community, in which case I think your points around G20 engaging through the BRICS, finding common ground with China and others are essential. I think one thing that, Robert, you raised with me previously that I think really applies here is the term compute governance is seen by China very much as containment or very much related to export controls. And so that raises a question for me as to whether you actually need a new taxonomy when you're trying to engage more broadly, like whether it's about AI safety or responsible AI management that leverages compute, rather than the compute governance that seems to bind together more of the US and allied approach. And I think other actors in the region that would be really useful to engage would be sort of the ASEAN groups and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as well, to sort of get that broader buy-in. But I think your points around incentives and wrapping it up in broader capacity building measures are really, really sound.
Thanks, Janet. Billy?
Well, no, I just wanted to say that in terms of, what are those risks beyond the sort of geopolitical ambitions of using compute as a control point for kind of denying capabilities and sort of economic warfare almost. What are the risks that we all have in common and could agree as a world society to regulate? I think it's fair to say that the discourse on that is quite, to put a positive spin on it, quite sort of forward-looking. And that could be justified on the basis that governments sort of missed the boat on things like social media, that first problems happened and then afterwards attempts to fix them. So the idea is, well, let's try to get ahead of the curve this time. But then a more critical take on it is that Sam Altman has been an excellent salesman going around the world talking about how generalized artificial intelligence poses a massive existential risk, and that has gotten everyone very sort of concerned, and we have to put in some regulations to avoid some, it's not exactly clear what, but that is certainly something that has energized, I think, the debate.
Yeah, thanks. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah. Sam, would you just pass it one back?
Thank you so much for the super interesting discussion and conversation. I really appreciate your point, Janet, on sort of the symbolic power of sort of de-risking this discourse. My question is, so beyond the sort of symbolic power of pursuing sovereignty, are there sort of different thresholds of de-risking? So to provide an analogy, for example, from semiconductors in Taiwan, there could be like, you know, having enough supply of legacy chips so you have some iPhones in your country, and then there's sort of levels up where you're investing more, and there's sort of the next frontier of logic chips. So is there an analogous sort of levels of sort of de-risking here, or pursuit of levels of sovereignty that applies specifically to these forms of compute?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think of it more instead of different levels, I think of it more in sort of responding to different kinds of risks. And so, like, one of the things you could think about in more detail is the application of like technical controls on chips that actually preserve confidentiality and make it impossible for commercial secrets or the specifications of the models or data to be observed by the compute providers, which means that then their oversight through their compute provision is limited to the metadata of how a chip's configured, how are they used, like how much power is running through them, and then those things are used to glean insight. So that's an example as to a potential way of de-risking for Canada if they're worried about their commercial property and commercial intelligence being taken or leveraged by the US. And then I think also another reason you might want to be pursuing sovereignty could come down to if you think that the market is not delivering on the things that are important for your country. And so I think a lot of the supercomputing initiatives, as we were speaking about earlier, are around, we need to make more subsidized compute available for researchers, for public good projects, and those issues. And so I think you're very right in that there's a lot of nuance you can take when you're considering, should I be building sovereign capacity for my country, or does my country need sovereign capacity? And it won't always be, is it a US-China dynamic? But I think there's a lot of nuance you can inject into why you want sovereignty and how you want to achieve that.
Great. Well, we just have a few minutes, so I don't know if there's a last question from the audience. If not, we will chat up here.
I'm breaking through my social anxiety and asking a stupid question. I can't think I'm being naive, but who in their right minds would trust these players to act as umpires? I'm sitting in this room remembering the history of the East India Company and the Hudson Bay Company. That sort of privatizing didn't go down very well amongst the people it was influencing. Surely someone should be rethinking who's regulating in these markets and who should be regulating.
Yeah, that was much discussed issue. Who's regulating the people who are doing the regulating in some way? Yeah, I don't, Leonard or Janet, I know that was much talked about in the writing of this paper, as I recall. Does anybody want to weigh in on that? And feel free also.
I would say one thing. There are ongoing investigations on the market powers of cloud providers, and there are also ongoing investigations of the compute partnerships. So we have in the US an ongoing investigation looking to the compute partnerships of these AI companies with these cloud providers. And besides that, the US and the UK have ongoing investigations into the market powers of these cloud providers of being too vertically integrated, right? I think as we all were just saying here, from a governance perspective, sometimes it's all just promised because like, well, it's only 6 companies, or like probably even less, like only 3 or 4 in the Western markets, who have the significant power here. This makes my life sometimes easier because I only need to talk to these 4 to implement them and have a big win. On the other side, as just was highlighted, this brings up a bunch of other questions from market concentration, abuse of power, and everything else there. We didn't touch upon this topic in detail for the paper because it deserves a lot of attention and it deserves experts on these kinds of things. I think none of us were experts on market concentration, monopolies, and everything more beyond that. But again, we need more empirical data here, which Billy and others are like really pushing forward to like learn more about this. And then again, more investigations here of what's going on here. And I'm keen to see more research and more rigorous analysis of these dynamics in general for cloud providers, but also in particularly known context with AI, right? It also poses the questions. Our foundation models are natural monopoly. What does this mean? What should we do there? And lucky us to some degree, we see, for example, the UK government, DMC and others looking to these kinds of things. And I think they just published an updated report on foundation models at least. And they talk about the whole supply chain there, which is a surprisingly concentrated supply chain, which poses a bunch of questions.
Yeah, just building on that as well, I think that's a really good question about how you diffuse power and oversight across an ecosystem. Because I think a lot of people have the same concerns if you said, oh, government should be able to see how chips are being used and for what purpose. And I think some people have the same concern of, wow, these AI companies are super powerful. They seem to just be able to set their own commitments, and how do we even check if anyone's adhering to them? And so I think these questions are really, really useful in sort of working out as a society, how do we start to have diffuse power across different actors, so there's checks and balances, and still government and, public oversight setting some of the parameters, but also safeguards, like baked in technical safeguards on chips. That means you can't actually see, as a provider of compute, you actually can't access that data, for example, or you can't see what exactly is on that chip. And so I think that is a really good question, and one that does need further work, as Lennart says. But for me, the answer wouldn't be that government does it all either in the US. I think going back to the Underground Empire book that was referenced earlier, like a lot of examples of when an ability to see into something or ability to have oversight of something is then leveraged for other purposes down the line by governments. It's about having that balance so that there's divided responsibility, but it's still commensurate with risk management.
Last comment, Billy?
I mean, I think therein lies this interesting tension that on the one hand would be great if government had more influence over these tech giants, but if that was the case, it wouldn't necessarily be your government that has that influence. And therefore, we might actually be better off in some ways with slightly more independent tech empires acting as the umpires rather than the US State Department or indeed Beijing.
So I need to wrap it up, but I want to say very quickly that in line with what Janet said, I think, and in part answer to that, one perspective is, we don't want to just rely on cloud providers. We also need reporting requirements for AI firms. We need them reporting, and then maybe we need the cloud providers reporting, and we need to check one against the other. And then we also need to be monitoring each of them separately as best we can. And when I listen to all of this, even though it's so much recognized that we don't have all the answers, and certainly we don't in AI governance internationally, in spite of that, some aspects of maybe a reasonable international regime that involves kind of reporting requirements that we're talking about from the AI firms, involves maybe a regime for cloud providers also, is thinking about where liability sits in the value chain, and you combine all these elements, and maybe we're sort of stumbling, or we have the potential to stumble towards something that could actually be workable. So I want to thank the authors of the paper that was described, Janet and Leonard, and our panelists here on the stage, Noah and Billy. Please join me in thanking all of them.